My son and daughter-in-law beat me for my property, but I had already given it all away. My own son held my arm so hard it left bruises, screaming at me to sign my house over to him. His wife stood behind him, telling him not to stop until I gave in. What neither of them knew was that the property they were so desperate to steal from me had already stopped being mine to give, months before they ever raised a hand against me. My name is Harold. This is the story of what happens when greed blinds people to the truth, sitting right in front of them. I built my life from almost nothing. I grew up the son of a farmhand, one of 6 children in a house with barely enough room for all of us, and I understood from a very young age that nothing in this world would be handed to me. I left school after the 10th grade to work full-time, first in a lumber yard, then eventually in construction, learning every trade I could get my hands on until I understood buildings from the foundation up. I married my wife, Ruth, when I was 22, and together we built a life the same careful way I'd learned to build everything else, slowly, honestly, one decision at a time. I started my own small construction company in my late 20s, and over the following 4 decades, that company grew into something substantial, building homes and small commercial properties across our county, earning a reputation for quality work that meant I never lacked for contracts, even during difficult economic years. Ruth and I had one son, Kevin, born when I was 31, a boy I loved with the same fierce, uncomplicated devotion that had characterized every other part of how I approached my life. I worked hard to give Kevin opportunities I had never had myself, a stable home, a good education, a business he could eventually inherit if he wanted it, a life built on more security than I had ever known as a child. Ruth passed away 12 years ago, cancer, the same slow and painful decline that takes so many people I've known over the years. I never remarried. I kept living in the same house we'd built together decades earlier, kept running my business until my body simply couldn't manage the physical demands of construction work anymore, and eventually retired, at 72, with a comfortable nest egg, a paid-off house, and a business I had sold to a longtime employee for a fair price that added further to my savings. Kevin married a woman named Deborah when he was 28, a marriage I supported wholeheartedly at the time, genuinely hopeful for my son's happiness and eager to welcome a new member into our small family. I'll be honest, looking back now, that I noticed things about Deborah early on that I chose not to examine too closely, the same way I suspect many parents choose not to examine uncomfortable observations about their children's spouses, not wanting to create conflict or seem like an interfering, judgmental father-in-law. Deborah had a way of discussing money that struck me, even in those early years, as more calculating than I was entirely comfortable with comments about our house's value, questions about the specifics of my retirement savings, an interest in the details of my business sale that seemed to go beyond ordinary family curiosity. Kevin, for his part, had grown, over the years of his marriage to Deborah, increasingly focused on financial matters in a way that felt different from how I had raised him, different from the values I had tried to instill in him growing up about the importance of building things honestly through your own effort. I told myself this was simply the natural influence of marriage, of building a shared life and shared financial goals with a partner, without fully recognizing, at the time, how much that influence was reshaping fundamental aspects of my son's character. Everything shifted, in terms of how directly Kevin and Deborah began focusing on my finances and property, following a health scare I experienced about 3 years ago, a serious cardiac event that required emergency surgery and a lengthy hospital stay, one that, for a period of several days, left my prognosis genuinely uncertain. I remember Kevin and Deborah visiting frequently during that hospitalization, a level of attention and apparent concern that I appreciated at the time, interpreting it simply as love and worry for my well-being during a frightening medical crisis. It was only in retrospect, looking back with the clarity I eventually gained, that I understood how much of that attention had actually been focused on assessing the situation, on beginning to calculate what might happen to my property and savings if my health continued to decline. I recovered from that cardiac event more fully than the doctors initially expected, returning home after several weeks of hospitalization and rehabilitation to a level of independence and health that surprised even my own cardiologist. But something had shifted, I noticed, in how Kevin and Deborah related to me. Following that scare, a new, persistent focus on questions about my will, about my property, about what plans I had made for the eventual distribution of my assets, questions that arrived with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety over the following months. The first direct request came about 4 months after my recovery, during what I initially believed was an ordinary Sunday dinner at my house, a tradition Kevin and Deborah and I had maintained fairly consistently over the years of their marriage. "Dad," Kevin said, partway through dinner, in a tone that immediately signaled this wasn't simply ordinary family conversation. "Deborah and I have been talking, and given everything that happened with your heart, we think it makes sense to start transferring some of your property into my name now, rather than waiting for something to happen to you unexpectedly. It would simplify things enormously, avoid probate complications, make sure everything transitions smoothly." I remember feeling a distinct unease hearing this request, not because transferring property to an adult child before death is inherently unreasonable. Many people make exactly this kind of decision for entirely legitimate reasons, but because something about the timing, the framing, the way Deborah watched me carefully from across the table as Kevin spoke, suggested this wasn't really about simplifying probate at all. "I appreciate you thinking about this, Kevin," I said carefully, "but I've already got a will in place that handles all of this. I'm not in any rush to start transferring property while I'm still very much alive and using it myself." Deborah's expression, in the brief moment before she composed herself back into pleasant neutrality, told me everything I needed to know about how unwelcome my response had been. Over the following year, this same basic request resurfaced repeatedly, in various forms, with increasing frequency and, gradually, increasing pressure behind it. Kevin would raise it during what were meant to be ordinary family visits, framing it in terms of practical estate planning, tax advantages, avoiding complications for "when the inevitable eventually happens," a phrase that, said about my own death by my own son, never stopped landing with a particular kind of coldness, no matter how many times I heard some version of it repeated. Deborah, for her part, took a somewhat different approach, focusing her comments on comparisons to other families she knew, other elderly parents who had done the smart thing and transferred property early, framed always in terms of what a good, responsible, loving family would naturally choose to do, an implicit suggestion that my continued reluctance reflected some failure of trust or love toward my own son and his wife. I continued declining these requests, consistently, but as gently as I could manage, hoping to avoid the kind of open family conflict that I sensed was building beneath the surface of these increasingly frequent conversations. I told myself, during this period, that Kevin's focus on the property was simply misguided financial anxiety, encouraged unhelpfully by Deborah's influence, rather than something more troubling about who my son had actually become over the years of his marriage. It was during this same period, roughly 18 months before the events I'm about to describe, that I began quietly making decisions about my estate that I did not discuss with Kevin or Deborah, decisions informed by a growing unease about the pattern I had been observing in their behavior. I met with an estate attorney, a careful, experienced woman named Linda Foster, who had handled legal matters for my construction business for years, and who I trusted completely, given our long professional relationship. I explained to her, honestly, the pattern of increasingly pressured requests I had been receiving from Kevin and Deborah, and my growing concern about what might happen to my property and my own well-being if that pressure continued to escalate. Linda helped me establish an irrevocable trust, one that would take effect immediately rather than waiting for my death, transferring the substantial majority of my property and savings into a structure that could not easily be altered or contested, with specific provisions I want to describe carefully, because they matter enormously to how this story eventually unfolds. The majority of my assets, my house, my remaining savings, the proceeds from my business sale, went into this trust, structured to benefit, upon my eventual death, a combination of causes and people I genuinely cared about. A significant portion to a scholarship fund for young people pursuing trade careers, similar to the path that had given me my own start in life. A portion to my niece, Carol, my late wife Ruth's sister's daughter, who had shown me consistent, uncomplicated care and attention over the years, without ever once asking me about money or property, and a smaller but meaningful portion that would eventually go to Kevin himself, structured carefully, with provisions requiring him to demonstrate financial responsibility and stability rather than receiving a lump sum outright. I did not tell Kevin or Deborah about any of this. I understood, even as I made this decision, that revealing it directly would likely accelerate whatever pressure they were already applying, and I wanted, for as long as possible, to continue living independently and peacefully in my own home, without triggering an open confrontation I wasn't yet prepared to navigate. Over the following months, the requests from Kevin and Deborah shifted from occasional, if uncomfortable, conversations into something that felt increasingly like sustained pressure campaign, one that I found genuinely difficult to navigate as a man in his mid-70s who simply wanted to live out his remaining years in peace. Deborah began visiting more frequently on her own, without Kevin present, conversations that started pleasantly enough, but almost always circled back, eventually, to questions about my finances, my will, my plans for the property. She began bringing paperwork on some of these visits, documents she described as just standard transfer forms that she encouraged me to sign to make things easier down the road. Paperwork I consistently declined to sign without having Linda review it first, a delay tactic that seemed to frustrate Deborah increasingly with each visit. Kevin, during this same period, began raising the topic with a kind of urgency that felt less like ordinary estate planning conversation and more like genuine desperation, mentioning, on several occasions, unspecified financial pressures he and Deborah were apparently facing, pressures that made access to my property feel, to him, increasingly critical rather than simply advantageous. I began, during this period, quietly documenting these interactions, dates, general content of conversations, my consistent refusals, partly at Linda's careful suggestion, understanding that this kind of documentation might eventually become important if the situation continued escalating in the direction it appeared to be heading. I want to describe, as carefully and honestly as I can, the evening that changed everything about how I understood my son and daughter-in-law, an evening that still, even now, remains difficult for me to fully revisit. Kevin and Deborah arrived at my house unannounced on a Thursday evening, a departure from our usual pattern of at least brief advance notice before visits. I could tell immediately, from Kevin's tense posture and Deborah's sharp, focused expression, that this visit was different from the pressure campaign of the preceding months. "Dad, we need to finalize the property transfer tonight," Kevin said, once we were seated in my living room, his voice carrying a kind of hard edge I had genuinely never heard from him before in his entire adult life. "I know you keep putting this off, and I need you to understand that this isn't optional anymore. We have serious financial problems that need to be resolved immediately, and this house, this property, needs to be in my name now," I told him, as calmly as I could manage given the escalating tension in the room, that I would not be signing anything without Linda's review, the same consistent boundary I had maintained for over a year at this point. What happened next, I still find difficult to describe without my hands trembling slightly. Even now, months later, Kevin grabbed my arm, hard enough that I would discover, examining myself later that night, deep bruising across my forearm, where his fingers had dug in, with a force I had genuinely never experienced from my own son before. "You're going to sign this, Dad," he said, his voice raised now, genuinely frightening, in a way that felt entirely disconnected from the boy I had raised, the man I had watched grow into what I believed, until this exact moment, was a fundamentally decent person, despite his recent troubling focus on my property. "I don't want to do this the hard way, but you're leaving me no choice." Deborah, standing near the doorway, did not intervene to calm the escalating situation. Instead, she said, in a voice that chilled me more than Kevin's raised anger somehow managed to, "Don't let go until he signs, Kevin. We don't have time for him to keep stalling us. I want to be honest about what happened over the following several minutes, because I think the details matter, even though they remain painful to recount." Kevin did not release my arm. He continued applying pressure, pushing a stack of papers toward me with his other hand, demanding repeatedly that I sign, while Deborah stood watching, offering no resistance to what was, by any reasonable definition, physical assault being committed against an elderly man by his own son. I did not sign the papers that night. I told them, through what I remember as genuine physical pain and a kind of disbelieving heartbreak I had never experienced before in my life, that I would not be signing anything under these circumstances, that they needed to leave my house immediately. Kevin eventually released my arm, and he and Deborah left, though not before Deborah delivered a final, quiet threat on their way out the door. "This isn't over, Harold. We'll be back, and next time, you're going to sign." Once Kevin and Deborah had left, I sat alone in my living room for a long time, processing what had just happened, before finally making a series of decisions that would shape everything that followed. I first called Linda Foster, despite the late hour, understanding that what had just happened required immediate legal attention rather than waiting for ordinary business hours. Linda, to her enormous credit, answered immediately and talked me through, calmly and clearly, the steps I needed to take that same night. I then called the local police department, reporting the physical assault I had just experienced, understanding, even through my shock and pain, that documenting this incident properly and immediately was essential both for my own physical safety going forward and for whatever legal proceedings might eventually become necessary. An officer arrived within the hour, documented the bruising on my arm with photographs, took a detailed statement about what had happened, and explained clearly that what Kevin and Deborah had done constituted assault and attempted coercion, serious crimes, regardless of the family relationship involved. I also, that same night, with Linda's guidance, began the process of obtaining a restraining order against both Kevin and Deborah, a decision that felt, even as I made it, like one of the most painful choices of my entire life, formally, legally separating myself from my only son in order to protect my own basic safety. I want to describe honestly how difficult the weeks following that assault actually were, both physically and emotionally, because I think it's important not to rush past the genuine trauma of what I experienced. The bruising on my arm took nearly 3 weeks to fully heal, a constant physical reminder, every time I looked at it, of what my own son had been willing to do to me. I struggled to sleep during this period, found myself, more than once, checking that my doors were locked multiple times before finally settling into bed, a kind of vigilance I had never needed to maintain in my own home before this. I also grieved during these weeks, something that went beyond the physical assault itself, the grief of understanding, with complete and undeniable clarity, that my son had become someone capable of physically harming his own elderly father over property. Someone who had watched his wife encourage that harm rather than intervene to stop it. This grief felt, in some ways, even more profound than the grief I had experienced when Ruth passed away 12 years earlier, because at least her death had been an ordinary, if painful, part of life's natural course, rather than a betrayal by someone who was supposed to love and protect me. I leaned heavily during this period on my niece, Carol, who, upon learning what had happened, began visiting me almost daily, helping with practical tasks, sitting with me through difficult evenings, providing the kind of steady, uncomplicated care and presence that Kevin and Deborah had, in their pursuit of my property, apparently become entirely incapable of offering. The formal hearing for the restraining order took place about 6 weeks after the assault, in a small courtroom that felt, sitting there as a man in his mid-70s formally testifying against his own son, like one of the strangest and most painful experiences of my entire life. I testified honestly about what had happened that Thursday evening, the demand to sign property transfer papers, Kevin's grip on my arm, the bruising that resulted, Deborah's chilling instruction not to let go until I complied, the explicit threat delivered as they finally left my house. The police officer who had responded that night testified as well, presenting the photographic evidence of my injuries and confirming the details of my initial statement. Kevin's lawyer attempted various strategies to characterize the incident as a misunderstanding, an emotional family disagreement that had been exaggerated in its retelling. But the photographic evidence of clear bruising, combined with my consistent, documented testimony, made this defense difficult to sustain convincingly. The judge granted the restraining order, formally prohibiting both Kevin and Deborah from contacting me or coming within a specified distance of my property for a period of 3 years, a legal outcome that provided practical protection even as it confirmed, with painful finality, the complete breakdown of my relationship with my only son. It was approximately 4 months after the restraining order was granted that Kevin and Deborah, apparently still operating under the assumption that my property remained fully mine to eventually transfer or bequeath, retained their own attorney to explore legal options for challenging what they had learned, through some channel I never fully discovered, about the trust I had established over a year earlier. Their attorney contacted Linda's office, seeking information about the trust structure, presumably hoping to find grounds to challenge its validity, or, at minimum, to understand what remained available for Kevin to eventually inherit, despite the trust's existence. I want to describe, with what I hope comes across as appropriate restraint, rather than any triumphant satisfaction, exactly what Kevin and Deborah learned during this process: that the substantial majority of my property and savings had been irrevocably transferred into a trust structure over a year before the assault ever took place, well before their pressure campaign had escalated into physical violence, a structure that could not be challenged or unwound, simply because they were unhappy with its provisions. Kevin, I later learned through Linda's careful, professional communication with his attorney, reacted to this discovery with what was described to me as genuine shock, apparently having believed, throughout the entire escalating campaign of pressure and eventual assault, that the property remained fully within my control, and therefore fully available to be coerced away from me, given sufficient pressure. I want to sit with this reality for a moment, because I think it matters enormously to the full understanding of this story. My own son had grabbed my arm hard enough to leave deep bruising, had stood by while his wife instructed him not to release his grip until I complied, had threatened to return and force compliance through whatever means proved necessary, all in pursuit of property that had already, over a year earlier, stopped being mine to give away. The house Kevin had been so desperate to have transferred into his name was, by the time of the assault, legally protected within an irrevocable trust benefiting a scholarship fund, my niece Carol, and, eventually, a structured, conditional portion for Kevin himself, assuming he demonstrated the kind of stability and responsibility the trust's provisions required. Every threat, every escalating demand, every moment of physical violence Kevin had inflicted upon me had been, in the most literal and painful sense possible, entirely for nothing, pursuing control over assets that no longer existed in the form he believed they did, that could not have been transferred to him through coercion, regardless of how much pressure or violence he might have applied. It has been just over 2 years since the assault, and I want to describe honestly where things currently stand with my only son, because I think the fullest, most useful version of this story includes the parts that remain difficult and unresolved. Kevin has never formally apologized for what happened that Thursday evening, at least not directly to me. Through Linda's occasional professional communication with his attorney regarding the ongoing terms of the restraining order, I've learned that he has expressed some version of regret, though filtered entirely through legal channels rather than any direct, personal accountability that might allow for genuine reconciliation. Deborah, from what limited information has reached me, has shown no indication of remorse whatsoever, apparently continuing to characterize the entire situation as an unfair overreaction on my part to what she still describes as an ordinary family disagreement about estate planning. I have not seen or spoken with my son in over 2 years now, a reality that continues to bring genuine grief even alongside the necessary protection the restraining order provides. I think often about the boy I raised, about the version of Kevin that existed before Deborah's influence, and, I suspect, his own underlying character flaws, combined into something capable of the violence he ultimately inflicted upon me. I don't know whether that earlier version of my son still exists somewhere beneath who he's become, or whether genuine change remains possible for him, the way it eventually proved possible for other people in similar stories I've heard about, since sharing pieces of my own experience with others, going through comparable situations. I want to share, before concluding this story, what has developed in the 2 years since these events, particularly regarding my niece Carol, and the trust structure that ultimately protected me from losing everything to my son's coercion. Carol has become, over these past 2 years, something akin to the daughter I never had, visiting regularly, helping manage practical aspects of my life as I've continued aging, providing exactly the kind of uncomplicated, genuine care that Kevin and Deborah proved themselves entirely incapable of offering, once property and money entered the equation of our relationship. I've adjusted the trust's provisions slightly, with Linda's careful guidance, to reflect the depth of genuine care Carol has shown me, though I've maintained the core structure, protecting the scholarship fund and the conditional provisions for Kevin, understanding that his eventual path back to at least partial inheritance remains available to him, should he ever demonstrate the kind of genuine accountability and change that might make trusting him with even a portion of my legacy feel appropriate again. The scholarship fund, established through the trust, has already begun operating, providing support to 3 young people this past year alone, pursuing trade careers similar to the path that gave me my own start in life decades ago, a legacy that feels, to me, considerably more meaningful than simply handing my accumulated property directly to a son who attempted to obtain it through violence and coercion. If you're watching this because you're facing pressure from your own adult children regarding property or estate planning, pressure that has started to feel less like ordinary family conversation and more like something approaching coercion, I want you to hear something important. Trust your instincts about that shift, and don't wait until physical violence occurs before taking protective legal action. I waited far too long, I believe now, looking back, to establish the trust that ultimately protected me, hoping that Kevin's troubling focus on my property represented a passing phase rather than something more deeply concerning about who he and Deborah had actually become. I don't regret establishing that protection when I finally did, but I do believe, with the clarity of hindsight, that recognizing the warning signs earlier and taking protective action sooner might have prevented the assault itself from ever occurring. And if you're an adult child who has found yourself, perhaps influenced by a partner's persistent focus on money or property, applying increasing pressure to an aging parent regarding their estate, I hope this story reaches you with an important reminder. Whatever financial pressures or desires you're experiencing, they do not justify coercion, threats, or violence against the people who raised you. The relationship you damage through that kind of behavior is worth infinitely more than whatever property or money you might believe yourself entitled to receive. I built my life from nothing, through decades of honest, careful effort. I am grateful, even now, even through the genuine grief of losing my relationship with my only son, that I found the strength and the legal protection necessary to ensure that everything I built would ultimately serve purposes I genuinely believed in, rather than rewarding the kind of coercion and violence that no parent should ever have to experience from their own child. About 5 months after Kevin and Deborah's own lawyer confirmed, through Linda's office, that the trust could not be challenged or unwound, I received an unexpected call from Linda, asking to meet in person, rather than discussing whatever she needed to tell me over the phone. Sitting across from her in her office, the same office where we had first discussed establishing the trust nearly 2 years earlier, Linda explained that Kevin's attorney had reached out again, this time with a different tone, entirely not seeking information about challenging the trust, but asking, almost delicately, whether I might be willing to consider any form of direct communication with Kevin, given what the attorney described as Kevin's significant personal difficulties in the aftermath of everything that had happened. "I don't have details beyond that vague description," Linda told me, "but reading between the lines of how his attorney phrased things, I suspect Kevin's marriage may be in serious trouble, possibly connected to the financial pressures he mentioned during the period leading up to the assault. I wanted you to hear this from me directly, rather than secondhand, so you could decide for yourself how you wanted to respond, if at all." I sat with this information for several days before deciding how to proceed, feeling the same complicated mixture of lingering love and hard-won protective distance that I suspect anyone in my position would recognize. I discussed Linda's message extensively with Carol during this period, valuing her perspective enormously, given how consistently and genuinely she had shown up for me throughout the entire ordeal. "I think you get to decide this entirely on your own terms, Uncle Harold," she told me, sitting across from me at my kitchen table over the cups of tea that had become a regular ritual during her frequent visits. "I don't think there's a single right answer here, but I also don't think curiosity about what's happening with Kevin means you have to reopen a relationship that caused you genuine physical harm. You can care about what happens to him, even hope for his well-being, without necessarily deciding that direct contact is safe or wise at this point." This perspective, offered with the same steady clarity that had characterized Carol's support throughout this entire experience, helped me arrive at a decision I felt genuinely comfortable with. I would not initiate direct contact with Kevin, understanding that the restraining order and the boundary it represented remained necessary for my own protection and peace of mind. But I asked Linda to convey, through the appropriate legal channels, that I remained open to eventually hearing directly from Kevin himself, through written correspondence reviewed first by Linda's office, should he wish to communicate anything beyond what his attorney had vaguely referenced. Kevin's letter arrived at Linda's office about 3 weeks later, and after her review confirmed it contained no concerning content, she forwarded it to me, along with her own brief assessment that it appeared, in her professional judgment, to reflect genuine rather than manipulative intent. I want to share, honestly, what that letter contained, because I think it matters for understanding how this story continued to unfold. Kevin wrote that his marriage to Deborah had, in fact, ended, filing for divorce approximately 4 months after the failed attempt to challenge my trust. A collapse he attributed directly to finally understanding, with painful clarity, how much of his own behavior over the preceding years had been shaped and encouraged by Deborah's persistent focus on money and property, rather than reflecting his own authentic values. He wrote about attending therapy for the first time in his life, working through what he described as a slow, difficult process of understanding how he had allowed financial anxiety, amplified by Deborah's influence, to override every value I had tried to instill in him throughout his childhood, about honest, patient effort, rather than shortcuts or coercion. He wrote, too, about the assault itself, finally offering the direct, personal accountability that had been entirely absent from the legal proceedings and second-hand communications of the preceding 2 years. "I think about that night constantly, Dad," he wrote, I think about the sound of your voice when you asked me to stop, and I think about how I didn't stop, not because Deborah told me not to, but because some part of me had convinced myself that getting what I wanted mattered more than who I was becoming in the process of trying to get it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't think I've earned any right to expect that from you. I just needed you to know that I finally understand, fully and painfully, exactly what I did. I sat with Kevin's letter for nearly a month before deciding how or whether to respond, discussing it extensively with both Linda and Carol, and eventually, at Carol's gentle suggestion, with a therapist of my own, someone I had begun seeing periodically in the aftermath of the assault to help process the genuine trauma of everything that had happened. My therapist, a thoughtful woman named Dr. Reyes, helped me understand something important during this period of decision-making, that responding to Kevin's letter, even cautiously, even without any promise of full reconciliation, did not represent a failure to maintain appropriate boundaries. It simply represented one possible next step in an ongoing process that I retained complete control over, a process I could pause, slow, or stop entirely at any point if it ever began to feel unsafe or unwise. I ultimately wrote back to Kevin, a brief letter, reviewed first by Linda as our established channel required, acknowledging that I had read his words and that I believed, based on what he'd written, that his accountability appeared genuine. I was careful, though, to establish clearly that this acknowledgement did not represent an invitation to lift the restraining order or resume any direct, unsupervised contact, understanding that genuine change, if it existed, needed to be demonstrated consistently over real time before I would feel safe extending any further trust. Over the following year, a slow and carefully bounded process of communication developed between Kevin and me, entirely through Linda's office initially, gradually expanding as months passed without any concerning developments, into occasional supervised phone calls arranged through Dr. Reyes's professional guidance. Kevin continued his therapy consistently throughout this period, according to what he shared in our carefully bounded communications, working through not just the specific circumstances of the assault, but what he described as long-standing patterns of allowing financial anxiety and external validation to override his own authentic judgment, patterns that Deborah's influence had significantly amplified, but that he acknowledged, with what struck me as genuine self-awareness, had existed within him even before he ever met her. He found new employment, moving away from the higher-pressure financial industry role he had held during his marriage to Deborah, into a more modest position that he described, in one of our calls, as less impressive, but honestly, a lot more aligned with the kind of person I actually want to be, the kind of person you always tried to raise me to become. It was nearly 2 years after the initial assault, and roughly 14 months after Kevin's first letter, that I made the decision, with Dr. Reyes's professional support and Linda's careful legal guidance regarding the formal modification of the restraining order, to meet with Kevin in person for the first time since that terrible Thursday evening. We met at Dr. Reyes's office rather than either of our homes, a setting that felt appropriately neutral and supported given the significance of what this meeting represented. I want to describe, honestly, how strange and difficult it felt seeing my son in person after 2 years of complete separation, older looking than I remembered, thinner, carrying himself with a kind of careful humility that felt entirely unfamiliar compared to the confident, sometimes brash young man I had watched grow up. "Dad," he said, and I could see him fighting to maintain composure. "I don't have anything new to say beyond what I've already written. I'm just grateful you're willing to sit in the same room with me again. I know I don't deserve that, but I'm grateful for it regardless." We talked for nearly 2 hours that day, carefully, honestly, covering ground that felt both painful and, in its own complicated way, genuinely healing, not a full reconciliation, not yet. And I was careful to maintain that distinction clearly throughout our conversation, but a meaningful step forward, in a process that no longer felt entirely closed off, the way it had in the immediate aftermath of the assault 2 years earlier. It has been just over 3 years now since the assault that changed everything about my relationship with my only son, and I want to describe honestly where things currently stand, understanding that this remains an ongoing process rather than a neatly resolved conclusion. Kevin and I now see each other occasionally, perhaps once a month, always in settings that feel comfortable and appropriately paced, given everything that happened between us. The restraining order has been formally modified through the proper legal channels Linda helped navigate to allow this limited voluntary contact, though I have maintained, deliberately, the underlying legal protections that would allow me to reinstate stricter boundaries immediately should anything ever feel concerning again. Kevin has never asked me to reconsider the trust structure I established, understanding, I believe genuinely at this point, that whatever inheritance he eventually receives through the trust's conditional provisions needs to be earned through consistent, demonstrated change over time, rather than requested or expected simply because our relationship has begun, carefully, to heal. Deborah, from what limited information reaches me through Kevin's occasional updates, has remarried, apparently to another man of some financial means, a detail that Kevin shared without any particular editorial commentary. Simply as a fact, he thought I might want to know, given everything we had all been through together. Looking back now across this entire experience, the years of escalating pressure, the assault itself, the discovery that the very property they had assaulted me over no longer existed within their reach, and this slow, careful process of partial healing that has unfolded over the years, since I find myself returning to a lesson I first learned decades ago, building my construction business from nothing, that anything built to last requires patience, honesty, and a willingness to do things the difficult way, rather than searching for shortcuts. Kevin and Deborah tried to take, through pressure and eventually through violence, something that could only have ever been rightfully given through patience, honesty, and genuine relationship. That approach failed them completely, not simply because I had already protected the property through the trust, but because coercion and violence can never actually build the kind of genuine security and connection that people, I think, are truly seeking when they pursue inheritance or financial advantage through those methods. What Kevin has slowly, carefully begun rebuilding with me over these past 3 years, imperfect, incomplete, still cautiously bounded, has been built instead through the same patient, honest process that built everything valuable in my own life: consistent effort over real time, genuine accountability rather than manufactured urgency, a willingness to accept boundaries and consequences rather than demanding immediate forgiveness or restored trust. I don't know if Kevin and I will ever have the kind of full, unguarded relationship we once had before Deborah's influence and his own choices damaged it so severely. But I know that whatever we do eventually rebuild will be worth infinitely more than anything he might have gained through coercion, because it will be real, earned honestly, the same way everything worthwhile in my life has always been built. 3.5 years after the assault, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that gave no warning of what it would eventually become, I heard a car pull into my driveway that I did not recognize, followed a few moments later by a knock at my front door that was too hesitant to belong to a salesman and too deliberate to belong to a stranger who'd simply taken a wrong turn. I want to be honest about the way my body responded before my mind had even caught up to the situation. My hands went cold. My heart, the same heart that had already survived one frightening cardiac event years earlier, began beating harder than the moment seemed to justify. 3.5 years of careful healing, and still, some old animal part of me braced instantly for danger, the moment an unexpected knock disturbed the quiet of my afternoon. I looked through the side window before opening the door, the way I had trained myself to do ever since that Thursday evening that changed everything, and there, standing on my porch in a coat far too expensive for the modest street I lived on, was Deborah, I hadn't seen her in person since the restraining order hearing, over 3 years earlier. She looked, if anything, more polished than I remembered, her hair carefully styled, her makeup precise, a version of composure that struck me immediately as armor rather than genuine calm. I stood on the other side of that door for a long moment, deciding whether to open it at all. In the end, curiosity, and perhaps some lingering foolish hope that people can surprise you, won out over caution. I opened the door only partway, keeping the chain lock fastened, a small but deliberate boundary I had installed myself in the months following the assault. "Harold," she said, and her voice carried the same practiced warmth I remembered from all those Sunday dinners years before, the warmth that had always, in retrospect, been calculated rather than genuine. "I know I'm not supposed to be here. I know about the restraining order. I'm not here to cause any trouble, I promise you that. I just need 5 minutes." "You need to leave, Deborah," I told her, keeping my voice steady, despite the way my pulse continued hammering against my ribs. "You know exactly why you're not allowed on this property." "I know," she said, and for just a moment, something in her expression shifted, something that might have been genuine desperation rather than the practiced manipulation I had learned, over the years, to recognize in her. "But this isn't about the trust, Harold. This isn't about money at all. Not this time. It's about Kevin. There's something you need to know, and I don't think he's ever going to tell you himself. I did not let her inside my house. I want to be entirely clear about that, because I think the boundary itself matters as much as anything that was actually said between us that afternoon. But I did, against every instinct that told me to simply close the door and call Linda immediately, unlatch the chain, and step outside onto my own porch, positioning myself carefully near the door so I could retreat quickly if the conversation turned in any direction that felt unsafe. "Say what you came to say," I told her, "and then you need to leave." Deborah took a breath, and for the first time in the entire relationship I'd had with her, spanning back more than a decade, I watched something that looked genuinely like it cost her something to say out loud. "Kevin's new position, the one he took after we divorced," she said. "It's not as stable as he's told you. I still talk to people from our old life, Harold, people who know people at his company. There have been layoffs, significant ones. I don't know if he's been affected yet, but I know the industry, and I know it's coming for people at his level eventually. I think he's scared to tell you, because he thinks it'll look like exactly what it isn't. He thinks you'll assume he's coming back around for the money again." I stood there processing this, uncertain in that moment whether I was hearing genuine concern for my son or some new iteration of the same manipulation Deborah had always specialized in, dressed up this time in the costume of selfless warning rather than direct request. "Why would you tell me this?" I asked her, unable to keep a certain sharpness out of my voice. "What exactly do you get out of warning me about Kevin's job?" Deborah's composure cracked slightly, just at the edges, and what came through in that crack felt, to my considerable surprise, like something closer to honest regret than I had ever witnessed from her before. "I don't get anything out of it, Harold. That's exactly the point. I spent years treating every single thing about your family as a transaction, as something to calculate and maneuver. I lost my marriage because of that. I lost the chance to have any relationship at all with you, which I understand now I never actually deserved given how I behaved. I'm not asking you for anything today. I'm telling you because Kevin is proud, and he's scared of disappointing you again, and I think, whatever you decide to do with this information, you deserve to know it, rather than finding out only after things have already fallen apart for him." Deborah left a few minutes later, without asking for anything further, without any mention of the trust or the property, or any of the financial matters that had once consumed every conversation I'd ever had with her. I watched her car pull out of my driveway and disappear down the street, and I stood on my porch for a long while afterward, genuinely uncertain what to make of what had just happened. "I called Linda first," as I had trained myself to do with anything involving Kevin or Deborah, explaining the entire interaction in careful detail. Linda listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before responding. "I can't tell you whether her concern is genuine, Harold," she said. "I've seen enough people change genuinely over the years to know it's possible, and I've seen enough manufactured redemption stories to know it's also possible. She's simply found a new angle. What I can tell you is that nothing about what she told you asks anything of you directly. She didn't ask you to change the trust. She didn't ask you to give Kevin money. If this is manipulation, it's a strange, roundabout version of it that doesn't actually request anything concrete." I called Carol next, needing, as I so often did during difficult moments, her steady and uncomplicated perspective on a situation that felt anything but simple to me. "I think," Carol said, after listening to the whole story over tea at my kitchen table that evening, "that you don't actually have to decide right now whether Deborah's motives were pure. You just have to decide whether you want to check in with Kevin, the way any father might want to check in with his son during difficult times, regardless of who told you those times might be coming." This felt to me like the most useful way to frame the decision. Not a question of trusting Deborah, whose track record certainly didn't inspire blind faith, but simply a question of whether I wanted to reach out to my own son, the way any father naturally might, to see how he was actually doing. I called Kevin 2 days later, on one of our established, comfortable check-in days that had become part of our slow, careful rebuilding over the preceding 18 months. I didn't mention Deborah's visit directly, not at first, wanting instead to simply ask, honestly, how things were going, and to listen carefully to whatever he chose to share on his own. "Things are fine, Dad," Kevin said, in a tone that after 3.5 years of careful rebuilding between us, I had become skilled enough at reading to recognize immediately as not entirely honest. There was a strain underneath his words, a carefulness that hadn't been there in our last several calls. "Kevin," I said, deciding, after a moment's hesitation, to be direct rather than continuing to circle around the topic. "Deborah came to see me a couple of days ago. She told me she'd heard there might be layoffs coming at your company. I want you to know, I'm not asking because I'm worried about the trust, or about money, or about any of that. I'm asking because I'm your father, and I want to know how you're actually doing." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I genuinely wondered whether the call had dropped. "She came to your house?" Kevin finally asked, his voice tight with what sounded like a complicated mixture of surprise and something that might have been embarrassment. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know she was going to do that. I would never have wanted her showing up at your door, not after everything." "Kevin," I interrupted gently, "just tell me the truth. Are you in trouble?" Another long pause, and then, finally, something that sounded like genuine relief at no longer having to maintain the careful performance he'd apparently been keeping up throughout our recent calls. "I got laid off 3 weeks ago, Dad. I've been job hunting since, but the market's rough right now, and I didn't want to tell you because I was terrified you'd think I was setting up to ask you for money again, after everything I put you through. I couldn't stand the thought of you thinking that about me, so I just didn't say anything." I want to describe carefully what I decided to do in response to learning about Kevin's job loss, because I think the decision itself, and the reasoning behind it, matters considerably to the fullest understanding of this story. I did not offer Kevin money. I want to be entirely clear about that, because I think it would have been the easy, emotionally satisfying gesture in the moment, and also, I believed, the wrong one, given everything our relationship had already survived, and everything it was still, carefully, in the process of rebuilding. "I'm not going to give you money, Kevin," I told him, during that same phone call, choosing my words as carefully as I could manage. "Not because I don't love you, and not because I think you're lying to me about what happened with your job, but because I think both of us know, given our history, that money moving between us right now would complicate something we've worked very hard to rebuild honestly. What I will do is help you in other ways, if you want that help. I know people, even now, in construction and skilled trades, who might have opportunities, even temporary ones, while you keep searching for something in your own field. Kevin was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that sounded, to my relief, like genuine understanding rather than disappointment. That actually means more to me than money would have, Dad. I think a part of me needed to hear you say that boundary out loud, needed to know you'd hold it even now. It tells me this is real. It tells me you actually trust who I've become enough to treat me like an adult who can handle his own financial situation, instead of someone who needs to be rescued or who might use being rescued as an excuse to fall back into old patterns. We talked for a while longer that evening, about practical possibilities, about the specific skilled trade connections I still maintained even years into retirement, about a temporary position, doing basic accounting and office management for a small electrical contracting company, owned by a man I'd known for over 20 years, work that wouldn't fully use Kevin's financial background, but would keep him steady and employed, while he continued searching for something more aligned with his actual career. Kevin took the temporary position I helped connect him with about 2 weeks later, and over the following several months, something interesting began happening that neither of us had entirely anticipated. The work itself, modest and far below the level of his previous financial industry career, began to genuinely suit him in ways that surprised us both. "There's something about this work, Dad," he told me during one of our now weekly calls, several months into the position, "that feels honest in a way my old career never quite did. I'm helping a business that actually builds things, actually provides a service people genuinely need. It reminds me, honestly, of things you used to tell me growing up about your own construction business, about the satisfaction of work you could actually see the results of, rather than just moving numbers around on a screen." I found myself, listening to Kevin describe this shift, experiencing a complicated mixture of emotions, genuine happiness at hearing my son find something like authentic satisfaction in honest work, and also a kind of quiet, bittersweet recognition of how much simpler our entire relationship might have remained if Kevin had found his way to these values decades earlier, before Deborah's influence and his own choices had led him down the path that eventually resulted in genuine violence against his own father. The temporary position gradually became something closer to permanent, as the contracting company's owner, impressed by Kevin's work ethic and financial organizational skills, offered him an expanded role, managing the company's books, and eventually helping oversee bidding and contract management for larger projects. Work that drew, in an unexpected way, on both his financial background and the kind of hands-on, practical business understanding he'd absorbed growing up around my own construction company, even though he'd never worked in it directly himself. It was around this same period, roughly 4 years after the original assault, that Carol shared some news of her own that brought a different, entirely welcome kind of change into our small, rebuilding family. Carol had been seeing a man named Michael for nearly 2 years by this point, a relationship I'd watched develop with genuine happiness, given how much steady, uncomplicated support Carol had provided me throughout the most difficult years of my estrangement from Kevin. Michael was a school teacher, a patient, thoughtful man who Carol had met through a hiking group she'd joined partly, she admitted to me once, as a way of managing her own stress during the period when she'd been supporting me so consistently through the aftermath of the assault and the restraining order proceedings. "He asked me to marry him, Uncle Harold," Carol told me one evening, practically glowing with the kind of happiness that felt, after everything difficult our family had experienced together, like genuinely earned joy. I said yes, obviously, but I wanted you to be the first person I told, even before my own parents. You've become, over these past 4 years, something like a father to me, and I wanted you to know how much that's meant, especially during the years when things were hardest. I want to describe honestly how moved I was by this, sitting across from Carol at my kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared so many difficult conversations during the darkest period following the assault. I had raised one child, Kevin, with every hope and intention of building something lasting and good between us, only to watch that relationship nearly destroyed by greed and violence before beginning its slow, careful process of rebuilding. And here, unexpectedly, was Carol, who had shown up for me with consistent, uncomplicated love throughout the very years when Kevin had been unable to offer anything but coercion, now treating me with the kind of genuine familial warmth I had once believed I might never fully experience again. "I would be honored to be there, Carol," I told her, my voice catching slightly in a way I didn't try particularly hard to hide. "And if it wouldn't be too strange, given everything, I'd be honored if you'd let me walk you down the aisle, if your own father is comfortable with that." Carol's wedding took place about 8 months later, in early autumn, at a modest venue overlooking a small lake about an hour outside town, exactly the kind of understated, genuine celebration that felt true to who Carol actually was, rather than any kind of extravagant display. I want to describe one particular moment from that day, because I think it captures something important about how far our small, complicated family had traveled by that point. Kevin attended the wedding, invited by Carol herself despite the complicated history between us. And I watched, throughout the ceremony and the reception that followed, as my son interacted with genuine warmth and respect toward Carol, toward Michael, toward the extended web of family and friends who had gathered for the celebration. At one point during the reception, Kevin approached me where I was sitting near the edge of the dance floor, watching Carol and Michael share their first dance as a married couple. "She's incredible, Dad," Kevin said, settling into the chair beside me, watching the same scene I'd been absorbed in. "I mean that completely genuinely. I think about how she showed up for you during the years when I wasn't capable of being the son you deserved. I'll never be able to fully repay what she did for you during that time, but I wanted you to know that I see it, and I respect her enormously for it." This moment, small as it might sound described here, represented something significant in the ongoing process of Kevin's genuine transformation, an ability to hold both admiration for Carol's genuine care and honest acknowledgement of his own past failures, without any of the defensiveness or deflection that had characterized so much of his behavior during the years leading up to the assault. "She's become like a daughter to me, Kevin," I told him honestly. "I won't pretend that doesn't complicate things in certain ways, given everything that happened between you and me. But I think there's room in this family, going forward, for both the relationship I'm rebuilding with you and the relationship I've built with Carol. I don't think either one has to diminish the other." I want to share an update, at this point in the story, about the scholarship fund I established through the original trust, because I think it represents something important about what ultimately came from the entire painful ordeal Kevin and Deborah's coercion put me through all those years ago. By the 5th anniversary of establishing the trust, the scholarship fund had supported 11 young people pursuing trade careers, providing tuition assistance for technical and vocational programs in electrical work, plumbing, carpentry, welding, and various other skilled trades that had given me my own start in life decades earlier, before I ever built the construction company that eventually provided the foundation for everything that followed. I made a point, over these years, of attending the small annual gathering the fund organized for scholarship recipients, wanting to understand, in some direct and personal way, what my contribution was actually accomplishing in the lives of young people I'd never have otherwise encountered. I remember particularly meeting a young woman named Priya at one of these gatherings, in the fund's 4th year of operation, who had used her scholarship to complete an electrical apprenticeship program after growing up in genuinely difficult financial circumstances that had made any form of higher education feel entirely out of reach for her family. "I don't know if you understand what this actually meant," Priya told me that evening. her voice carrying a kind of genuine emotion that struck me deeply. Everyone in my life kept telling me that trade work wasn't really a legitimate path, that I needed a 4-year degree to be considered successful. This scholarship, and the fact that it specifically celebrated trade careers as worthy of investment, told me something different. It told me that the kind of work I actually wanted to do, the kind of work I was good at and found genuinely satisfying, was valued and worth supporting. I don't think I can fully express what that meant to someone who'd spent years being told, implicitly, that her chosen path was somehow lesser. Conversations like this one, repeated in various forms across each of the annual gatherings I attended, reinforced something I had come to believe deeply in the years since the assault. That whatever pain Kevin and Deborah's coercion had caused me, the trust I'd established to protect myself, had ultimately created something genuinely meaningful, something that would continue benefiting young people like Priya long after I was gone, regardless of whatever happened with my relationship with Kevin. It was during this same period, roughly 5 years after the original assault, that Kevin came to me with a proposal that genuinely surprised me, given everything about who he'd been during the years leading up to the coercion and violence that had nearly destroyed our relationship entirely. "Dad," he said, during one of our regular dinners, a tradition we'd carefully rebuilt over the preceding years, "I've been saving some money from the work I've been doing at the contracting company, and I wanted to ask you something. Would it be possible for me to contribute to the scholarship fund directly? Not to replace anything or to try to buy back trust. I know I still need to keep earning through actions, rather than gestures. I've been thinking a lot about what that fund represents, about the values it's built on, and I wanted to be part of supporting that, in whatever small way I actually can." I sat with this request for a long moment, genuinely moved by what it represented, while also, characteristically, wanting to think carefully before responding, rather than simply reacting to the immediate emotional impact of the moment. "I think that would mean a great deal to me, Kevin," I finally told him. "But I want to ask you something honestly first. Is this about genuinely wanting to support those values, or is some part of this still about trying to demonstrate something to me, trying to earn back a level of trust or inheritance consideration through gesture rather than through the kind of consistent, patient change we've been building over these past several years?" Kevin considered this question seriously, the same kind of honest self-reflection that had characterized so much of his genuine growth since that painful Thursday evening years earlier. "I think it's probably both, if I'm being completely honest with you, Dad. I don't think I can fully separate wanting to support something I've come to genuinely believe in from also wanting you to see that I've changed. But I don't think wanting both those things simultaneously makes either one less real. I've learned enough, through therapy, through the past several years of trying to rebuild things with you, that I don't think pure, uncomplicated motives are really how most genuine human change actually works. I just know I want to be part of this, for whatever combination of reasons actually exists inside me." I found his honesty about this complexity, rather than any attempt to present a simpler, more flattering version of his motivation, genuinely reassuring. It felt like exactly the kind of self-aware, unguarded honesty that Kevin had been incapable of during the years he'd spent pursuing my property, through pressure and eventually violence. It has been just over 5 years since that Thursday evening, when my own son grabbed my arm hard enough to leave deep bruising, when his wife stood in the doorway, instructing him not to release his grip until I complied with demands for property that had already, unbeknownst to either of them, stopped being mine to give away. I want to describe, as honestly as I've tried to describe everything throughout this story, exactly where things currently stand across the various relationships this entire ordeal ultimately reshaped. Kevin and I now see each other regularly, roughly every 2 weeks, a rhythm that feels sustainable and genuine, rather than obligatory or strained. He has continued his work at the contracting company, recently promoted into a more senior role, overseeing the business's overall financial operations, work that he describes consistently as more personally satisfying than anything he experienced during his years in the higher-pressure financial industry role he held during his marriage to Deborah. He contributes modestly but consistently to the scholarship fund, a practice that has continued now for over a year, and he has, on 2 occasions, accompanied me to the fund's annual recipient gatherings, conversations with young scholarship recipients that he describes as genuinely humbling, given his own history. Carol and Michael welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Ruth after my late wife, a gesture that moved me more deeply than I've generally found words to fully express. I visit them regularly, watching this new generation of our small, complicated, ultimately resilient family continue growing in ways I could never have fully anticipated during the darkest months following the assault. Deborah, from what limited information occasionally reaches me, remains married to the man she wed after her divorce from Kevin, though Kevin mentions, on the rare occasions her name comes up in our conversations, that their contact remains minimal and entirely centered on practical matters neither of them particularly enjoys discussing. The trust remains exactly as Linda and I structured it years ago, continuing to fund the scholarship program, continuing to provide for Carol's family, and continuing to hold, in careful reserve, the conditional provision for Kevin that requires ongoing demonstration of the kind of stability and genuine character he has, slowly and consistently, spent these past 5 years rebuilding. I want to close this continuing story with some reflection on what this entire extended ordeal has taught me, understanding now, with the added perspective of these additional years since I first shared the core events of this story, things I don't believe I fully understood in the immediate aftermath of the assault itself. I understand now that protecting yourself, whether through legal structures like the trust I established or through boundaries like the restraining order I was forced to pursue against my own son, does not have to mean permanently closing the door on genuine reconciliation, should that reconciliation eventually be earned through consistent, demonstrated change, rather than simply requested or expected. I understand, too, that genuine transformation in another person, even someone who has caused you genuine harm, remains possible, though it should never be assumed, rushed, or extended trust prematurely, simply because the possibility feels emotionally appealing. Kevin's transformation, over these past 5 years, has been real, I believe, precisely because it unfolded slowly, through consistent action over genuine time, rather than through any single dramatic gesture or apology that might have felt satisfying in the moment, while ultimately proving hollow. And I understand, perhaps most importantly, that the family we ultimately build, whether through blood relation or through the kind of chosen, earned loyalty Carol has shown me these past 5 years, matters far more than any property or financial legacy I might have once believed defined my life's ultimate achievement. The scholarship fund, supporting young people like Priya in pursuing honest, meaningful work, represents a legacy I believe in far more deeply than simply passing accumulated wealth directly to descendants, regardless of whether they've demonstrated themselves worthy of that trust. If you're watching this continuing story because the first chapters of my experience resonated with something in your own life, whether you're an aging parent navigating pressure from adult children, or an adult child recognizing, perhaps uncomfortably, patterns in your own behavior that echo Kevin's worst choices during the years before his genuine change, I hope this continuing change, I hope this painful chapter, healing, when it happens, tends to happen slowly, imperfectly, and only through genuine, sustained effort, rather than through any single transformative moment. But it does, sometimes, genuinely happen. If this continuation of my story moved you, if you've experienced your own version of estrangement and slow, careful healing within your family, I hope you'll share your own experience in the comments below. These conversations matter, and so many people watching need to know that healing, however imperfect and incomplete, remains genuinely possible even after profound betrayal. Thank you, as always, for staying with me through this ongoing journey. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.